The courtroom was packed with people waiting for the trial to begin. Among the crowd sat a woman named Sarah, wearing a plain dress and simple shoes. She looked out of place compared to the polished lawyers and the stern judge sitting high above. Sarah had no lawyer by her side. She had chosen to represent herself. When she stood to speak, the judge raised an eyebrow and let out a small laugh. He muttered loud enough for everyone to hear that this would be quick since she clearly did not know what she was doing. The audience chuckled too, some whispering that she had no chance. But Sarah did not flinch. She calmly adjusted the stack of papers she held in her hands and looked directly at the judge with quiet determination. The opposing lawyer smirked as he prepared his notes, certain that victory was his. He began with long sentences and heavy legal words, trying to overwhelm Sarah. But she listened carefully, without a single sign of fear. When it was her turn, Sarah spoke with clarity and confidence. She explained a fact step by step in simple language that everyone in the courtroom could understand. The judge leaned forward, surprised that her words carried such weight. She quoted laws precisely from memory and connected them to the case in a way that even seasoned lawyers struggled to do. The smirk on the opposing lawyer's face slowly faded. People in the audience who had laughed at her earlier now sat in silence, hanging on to her every word. Sarah walked over to present her evidence documents, neatly organized and undeniable. Each page, she showed, made her argument stronger, leaving no room for doubt. The judge cleared his throat, suddenly less amused as he realized this was not going the way he had expected. The opposing lawyer tried to object, but Sarah was ready. She countered with rulings from past cases, each one perfectly relevant. The room filled with murmurs of disbelief. How could this simple woman know so much? The judge tapped his gavel to quiet the room, but his expression had changed completely. What started as laughter was now replaced with respect and even a hint of nervousness. Sarah continued speaking, her voice steady, as she pointed out the flaws in the other side's arguments. The more she spoke, the more obvious it became that she had complete control of the courtroom. Every word she said was precise, every statement backed by fact. Even those who doubted her at first began to nod in agreement. The judge leaned back in his chair, staring at her as though seeing her for the first time. The silence that followed her closing words was so heavy it felt like the entire room held its breath. Then slowly applause began to echo through the audience, though it was quickly hushed by the gavel. The judge looked down at Sarah no longer with arrogance, but with an expression that revealed he had underestimated her greatly. And Sarah stood tall, calm, and composed, knowing that her brilliance had turned the entire trial upside down. The opposing lawyer shuffled his papers, his confidence shattered as he realized he had no strong argument left. Sarah stood quietly, waiting, her hands folded in front of her presence commanding without needing force. The judge cleared his throat again, but his voice had lost its sharp edge. Now it carried something different, a note of caution. He asked Sarah a question, one that seemed designed to trip her up, a question so complex that even an experienced lawyer might stumble. But Sarah did not falter. She took a breath and answered with ease, weaving her response with both logic and precedent. Her explanation was so clear that even the people in the gallery who knew nothing about law could follow along. The courtroom murmured again, this time not in mockery, but in awe. The judge rubbed his temples as if trying to process how this woman who appeared so ordinary was outshining everyone else in the room. The opposing lawyer tried one last desperate attempt to regain ground. He raised his voice, pointing at Sarah, accusing her of manipulating the facts. Sarah turned to face him, her calm gaze unshaken, and with a single statement, she dismantled his claim. The room fell silent once more. The lawyer sat down, his face pale and his voice gone. Sarah then turned back to the judge and spoke with respect but also with firm conviction, reminding him of his duty to justice and truth above pride. The judge, who had once laughed at her, now sat still, his pride bruised, but his mind forced to acknowledge the undeniable brilliance before him. The audience leaned in closer, every pair of eyes fixed on Sarah, as if they were watching history unfold before them. The judge shifted in his chair, his eyes narrowing as if searching for a weakness in Sarah's words, but none could be found. His gavel rested by his hand, yet he hesitated to use it because deep down he knew order was already restored, not by him, but by Sarah. One of the clerks leaned forward, whispering something to another clerk, their expressions showing both disbelief and admiration. The gallery that once sneered at Sarah now sat upright, silent, watching her every move as though they feared missing a single word. Sarah continued her explanation, laying out the details of the case step by step, each sentence more precise than the last. Her tone never wavered. She spoke with grace and confidence, as though the courtroom itself belonged to her. The opposing lawyer slumped in his seat. His earlier arrogance completely drained his papers, now nothing more than useless sheets before him. The judge finally leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his voice softer than before as he asked Sarah to clarify one final point. Sarah responded calmly, her reasoning flawless, her evidence undeniable. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that meant everyone knew the outcome even before the gavel would fall. The judge exhaled slowly, his eyes locked on Sarah, not with mockery this time, but with something closer to respect, something closer to fear. And still Sarah stood tall, waiting not for applause, not for validation, but simply for justice to be done. The judge cleared his throat, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying the pressure he felt under Sarah's steady gaze. He picked up the papers before him and scanned them quickly, as though hoping to find some loophole that could save his pride. But the truth was written clear in every word, and Sarah had already spoken them aloud for the entire court to hear. Whispers rose again from the gallery, but now they carried awe instead of scorn. Sarah turned her head slowly, meeting the eyes of those who had mocked her earlier, her calm expression silencing them without a single word. The bailiff stood at the side of the room, his posture stiff as he glanced between Sarah and the judge, almost as if waiting for the balance of power to tip completely. Sarah then walked toward the evidence table, placing her hand lightly on the documents. She had brought her voice steady as she reminded the court that the law was not about pride or position but about truth. The judge shifted again, this time looking smaller in his grand chair, as though the very weight of his robes pressed down on him. Even the opposing lawyer refused to raise his eyes, knowing the battle was lost long before the verdict was spoken. And Sarah stood in the center of it all, the quiet force who had turned ridicule into silence and silence into undeniable power. The judge finally lowered his gavel onto the desk, but the sound was weak and hollow compared to the strength of Sarah's words. He cleared his throat again, his voice quieter now as he admitted that the evidence left no room for dispute. The gallery leaned forward, hanging on every syllable, as though they knew history was being made before their eyes. Sarah remained steady, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze calm but unflinching as the weight of the moment settled in the room. The judge shifted uneasily, his pride slipping away piece by piece as he read aloud the ruling in Sarah's favor. Gasps echoed from the crowd, some in disbelief, others in admiration, as the reality of her brilliance could no longer be denied. Even the stenographer paused for a brief second, her fingers hovering above the keys as though caught in the awe of what she had just witnessed. The opposing lawyer gathered his papers, quickly avoiding Sarah's gaze, his earlier confidence shattered into silence. And Sarah, without a hint of arrogance, simply bowed her head slightly, a gesture of quiet strength that said everything words could not. The gallery erupted into whispers, people leaning close to one another, speaking Sarah's name, as if she had just rewritten the rules of the courtroom. The judge tapped his gavel again, trying to restore order, but the sound barely carried over the hum of astonishment. Reporters who had been lounging in the back now scrambled forward, their pens flying across notepads, desperate to capture the moment. Sarah stayed still, her posture calm, her eyes focused only on the truth she had brought into the light. The bailiff glanced at her with a look of respect, a subtle nod that said he knew she had accomplished what many thought impossible. Outside the courtroom, word spread quickly down the corridors, drawing more and more people to gather near the heavy wooden doors. The murmurs grew louder, as if the whole courthouse was coming alive, drawn by the story of a simple woman who had stood tall against power. Sarah turned slowly, collecting her papers with care, her movements unhurried despite the storm of attention swirling around her. Every eye followed her as she stepped away from the table, the sound of her footsteps echoing like a drumbeat of triumph. And in that echo, the judge himself looked down at his bench, his face pale, as though he realized he would never forget the name Sarah. The courtroom doors opened, and the crowd spilled into the hallway, their voices buzzing like a hive as Sarah walked calmly among them. Some people reached out just to brush her arm while others whispered words of encouragement, as if they had been waiting for someone like her to appear. The reporters pressed closer, their cameras flashing, questions flying through the air, but Sarah moved past them with quiet strength. Her composure made her presence even more commanding, as though she had no need to prove herself further. The truth had already spoken loud enough. The judge remained inside the courtroom, slumped in his chair, staring down at the desk before him, his earlier arrogance shattered like glass. Even the attorneys who had doubted Sarah exchanged uneasy glances, each one knowing they had witnessed something beyond their expectations. As Sarah walked through the marble hall, the sound of her heels against the polished floor grew rhythmic, steady, and powerful. It felt as if the courthouse itself was acknowledging her every step, the walls holding the story that would soon travel far beyond this place. By the time she reached the grand staircase, people had gathered at the bottom, craning their necks to see the woman who had just defied a judge with brilliance. Sarah paused for a moment at the top, her eyes sweeping across the sea of faces. Then she began to descend, each step a reminder that power does not always come from titles, but from courage and truth. The crowd at the base of the staircase parted as Sarah descended, their voices falling into silence, as if they knew they were in the presence of something rare. Every face turned toward her, some filled with admiration, others with disbelief, but all carrying a trace of respect that had not been there before. A young law student stepped forward, clutching his books tight, and asked how she had found the strength to stand against the judge. Sarah looked at him, her expression soft and steady, and she told him that strength is not found in titles or robes, but in refusing to be silenced when truth is at stake. The student's eyes widened, and he nodded slowly, as if the weight of her words had settled deep into his heart. Behind her, the doors to the courtroom opened again, and more people poured out, their conversations carrying her name like a banner. Sarah kept walking, the marble floor stretching long and bright ahead of her, her presence leaving a trail of whispers and wonder. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp and cool, the sky painted in colors of late afternoon, as though nature itself had paused to honor what had unfolded. Cars rolled by, slowing as drivers noticed the gathering at the steps, people standing shoulder to shoulder, drawn to the story they had just heard. Sarah stood still at the edge of the steps, her figure framed by the tall columns, the courthouse looming behind her, yet no longer intimidating. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone watching that the day had shifted, not just for Sarah, but for the very walls of justice themselves. The steps beneath Sarah seemed to hum with quiet energy as she gazed across the growing crowd gathered in front of the courthouse. People who had come for their own cases now lingered, holding their papers forgotten in their hands, drawn instead to the woman who had challenged power and won. Some held their phones high, recording her every move, while others simply stood in reverent silence, as if waiting for her next word. Sarah did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Instead, her calm presence carried farther than any speech could have. The law student who had spoken earlier stood nearby, his eyes still fixed on her with the expression of someone witnessing the shape of his own future. From the side of the courthouse, a line of news vans pulled up, their satellite dishes lifting toward the sky, ready to broadcast the moment to every corner of the city. The reporters spilled out quickly, but even their hurried footsteps slowed as they reached the crowd, sensing the gravity of what they were about to cover. Sarah remained composed, her papers tucked neatly under one arm, her gaze steady, as though she had walked this path 100 times before. The people began to murmur her name in unison, soft at first, then growing stronger, a rhythm that seemed to roll through the air like a wave. And as the sound rose around her, the courthouse itself appeared smaller behind her, no longer a place of fear, but a stage upon which truth had just rewritten the rules. The chant of her name swelled until it filled the square, a sound that wrapped around Sarah like a shield of strength. For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile, not of pride but of quiet relief that truth had found its place even against power. The reporters surged forward with their questions, but Sarah offered only a single sentence before stepping away. Justice belongs to everyone, not just those who wear the robe. The words hung in the air like a promise, carried swiftly by the cameras and the voices that repeated them across the city. Sarah turned and walked down the final steps, her figure dissolving into the crowd that now moved with her, not behind her, but beside her. The judge remained in his chambers alone and silent, his earlier laughter a distant memory replaced by the echo of her brilliance. By the time the courthouse lights flickered on that evening, the story of the simple woman who had silenced arrogance with truth had already spread far beyond the marble walls. And though Sarah faded back into her quiet life, the mark she left behind would remain unshaken, a reminder that power bows to wisdom and courage endures where titles fall.